Chapter 1. A Frosted Beginning. It was a morning of rare beauty in the little village of Marleycombe, a cluster of stone cottages and Tudor-fronted houses nestled among rolling hills. The first snow of the season had come in the night, soft and heavy, laying a white hush upon the world. Chimneys smoked faintly against the pale winter sky, and the sound of church bells drifted faintly across the meadows, muffled as though the air itself were holding its breath. At precisely 8 o'clock, Mr. Henry Fawcett, the postman, began his rounds. He was a broad-shouldered man, bundled in a thick scarf, his boots crunching in the snow as he trudged down the lane. Marleycombe was small enough that Mr. Fawcett knew not only the names but the secrets of nearly every villager, and as he paused at each gate to slip letters into boxes, he muttered his habitual remarks. "Bill won't like that, Bill. Mrs. Partridge still writing to her sister, I see. Ah, a Christmas card from Mrs. Hargreaves, about time too." So it went, until he came to the great house on the edge of the village, Blackthorn Manor, a sprawling Georgian estate that loomed dark against the whiteness. Its master, Colonel Arthur Blunt, was a man of some consequence, known for his irascible temper and rigid views on nearly everything from parish meetings to politics. The colonel had lived there since his retirement from the army and was, to many, a figure of both admiration and intimidation. Mr. Fawcett, stamping his boots against the frost, went up the long drive. It was there he noticed something peculiar. The snow, pristine everywhere else, bore the imprint of a single line of footsteps. They led up to the side door of the manor, but curiously there were no returning prints. He frowned. "Now that's odd," he muttered. "Odd indeed." Still, he left the post and continued his rounds. Yet the unease stayed with him, like a chill that crept beneath his scarf. By mid-morning, the village was buzzing. Mrs. Partridge, a sprightly widow with an unquenchable appetite for gossip, was the first to spread the word. She had heard from Mr. Fawcett about the footsteps, and that something was amiss at Blackthorn Manor. For when the housemaid, Alice, had come in to light the fires, she had found Colonel Blunt lying sprawled upon the carpet in the study, quite dead. His face was oddly twisted, his hand clutching the corner of a fallen chair. There were no signs of forced entry. The only clue, those strange footsteps in the snow. Within an hour, the village was in uproar. The constable was summoned, the doctor fetched, and speculation ran wild. Murder whispered some. Heart attack insisted others. But the footprints remained a puzzle. Who had entered the house in the night, and why had they not come out again? Meanwhile, in a modest cottage on the High Street, Miss Jane Marple, small and silver-haired, sat by her fire with her knitting. She listened quietly as her young maid, Gladys, breathlessly repeated the latest tidings, straight from Mrs. Partridge. "Colonel Blunt, murdered Miss. And they say the killer walked right into the house and vanished into thin air." Miss Marple did not look up from her needles, which clicked softly in her hands. Only her blue eyes, bright and thoughtful, betrayed the sharpness of her mind. "My dear," she said gently, "no one ever vanishes into thin air. There is always an explanation. One only has to look closely enough to see it." And with that simple remark, the first threads of a dark mystery began to weave themselves into the snowy fabric of Marleycombe. Chapter 2. Gossip in the village. The news of Colonel Blunt's death spread through Marleycombe faster than a biting wind across the common. By mid-morning, the snug little shops on the High Street, the bakery with its steaming loaves, the post office smelling of ink and brown paper, and Mrs. Biddle's drapery with its always crooked blinds, were alive with whispers. Mrs. Partridge, whose tongue could never be accused of idleness, was at the center of it all. Having learned of the strange discovery from Mr. Fawcett, she considered it her civic duty to repeat the tale in her own colorful manner. "Dead as a doornail, my dear," she announced to Mrs. Hargreaves in the grocer's. "Right there in his study, sprawled on the rug like he'd been struck down by the Almighty himself. And the queerest thing, only one set of footprints in the snow and none coming back out. If that doesn't sound like the devil himself, I don't know what does." Mrs. Hargreaves, who suffered from a nervous disposition, put a hand to her breast. "You don't say. In his own house. But how dreadful. Think of poor Mrs. Blunt." "Poor," sniffed Mrs. Partridge. "If you ask me, she looks more relieved than bereaved. They say he was a terror behind closed doors, and not just with her either. Had words with half the village last week about that land boundary near the mill. By the time the ladies parted, the tale had grown a dozen fresh embellishments. In the bakery, the murder was already attributed to foreign spies. At the smithy, it was the work of a poacher, exacting revenge. And outside the vicarage, 2 schoolboys whispered excitedly about a ghost that left no return tracks in the snow. Through all this, Miss Jane Marple listened without comment. She had gone to the village herself that morning, a basket on her arm, ostensibly to collect some fresh eggs. Her manner was gentle, unhurried, the way of one who belonged to the rhythms of a small community. But her sharp eyes missed little, the hushed eagerness of tongues wagging too freely, the half-guilty looks exchanged between certain villagers, the way Mrs. Blunt's name caused glances to dart aside. At the post office, she paused to remark pleasantly to Mr. Fawcett, who was still red in the face from repeating his discovery to all and sundry. "Such a sad business," Miss Marple said, her voice mild. "But footprints are curious things, aren't they? They tell a story if one only cares to read it." Mr. Fawcett, pleased to be treated as a man of importance, puffed out his chest. "I'm Miss Marple, and these told a strange one." Straight to the side door they went, and not a single step away. "I checked twice, I did." Miss Marple nodded as though merely indulging a fancy, yet her eyes remained thoughtful. She remembered the colonel well, blustering, overbearing, with a fondness for correcting others in the loudest possible tone. It was not difficult to imagine enemies in abundance. As she made her way home, Miss Marple reflected on what she had heard. Gossip, she knew, was rarely precise but often revealing. Beneath the exaggerations and false certainties lay grains of truth, if one had the patience to sift them. And Jane Marple had made a lifelong study of sifting. At her gate she paused. Across the lane, the widow Mrs. Blunt's curtains were firmly drawn. No callers went in or out. Yet behind those curtains, Miss Marple suspected, lay not just grief but something altogether different. Resentment, perhaps, or fear. She clicked her tongue softly, then went inside to set the kettle on. For mysteries, she believed, were best considered over a pot of tea. Chapter 3. The Study of Death. Blackthorn Manor had long been a landmark in Marleycombe, standing dark and square among its snow-draped pines. On this particular morning, the house seemed more forbidding than usual, its frosted windows gleaming coldly under a pale sun. Inspector Graves arrived shortly before 11. He was a stocky man with thinning hair and a rather mournful expression, more at home with petty thefts and drunken quarrels than with sudden deaths in manor houses. His boots left heavy imprints along the shoveled path, side by side with the strange single line of footsteps already much discussed in the village. The maid, Alice, pale as the linen she had been folding, admitted him with trembling hands. "He's in the study, sir. Just as we found him." The study was a masculine room, heavy with leather-bound books, military portraits, and the faint smell of pipe tobacco. Colonel Blunt lay stretched on the Persian rug near his desk. His great frame, once so commanding, seemed oddly diminished in death. His eyes stared glassily at the ceiling, his mouth twisted as though frozen mid-argument. A toppled chair lay beside him, one arm splintered. Dr. Whitaker, the village physician, stood nearby, rubbing his spectacles on a handkerchief. His face was grave, though not, Miss Marple might have noted, had she been present, especially surprised. "Heart failure, no doubt," he said to Inspector Graves, slipping his glasses back on. The colonel was not a young man, and he had the temper for apoplexy. Graves crouched by the body, his fingers brushing the stiffened hand. "Perhaps. Though it seems odd, doesn't it? A fit strong enough to knock him flat, yet he was clutching this chair as though he'd been startled." "Shock can manifest strangely," the doctor replied smoothly. "Still, I can arrange a post-mortem if you insist." The inspector looked about the room. Papers were scattered on the desk. Bills, military correspondence, and what appeared to be a torn envelope. On the hearth, the fire had burned low, only faint embers glowing. He stooped to examine the colonel's boots. They were clean, no trace of snow or mud. Locked doors, barred windows, and only one set of footprints leading to the house, Graves muttered. "It doesn't sit right." From the doorway, Mrs. Blunt's cool voice interjected. "Inspector, I trust you will not alarm the village with wild notions. My husband was a difficult man, but he did not deserve dramatics." She was an elegant woman still in her 40s, with dark hair pinned neatly back and lips pressed into a thin line. Her expression betrayed more fatigue than sorrow. "I assure you, madam," Graves said carefully, "we will conduct our inquiry with the utmost discretion, but unexplained matters must be clarified." Mrs. Blunt inclined her head as if granting permission, then withdrew, her skirts brushing the doorframe. Left alone with the doctor, the inspector frowned. If it were simple heart failure, doctor, why the footprints? Why the locked house? Dr. Whitaker's eyes flickered. "Superstition, my dear fellow. Villagers see a mystery where none exists. The truth, as always, is less fanciful." Yet as Inspector Graves stood in that heavy, silent room, with the body of Colonel Blunt sprawled before him, he could not shake the sense that death had entered Blackthorn Manor in a manner far from ordinary. And outside, the snow lay undisturbed, preserving its riddle in white silence. Chapter 4. The Widow's Worries. The blinds of Blackthorn Manor remained drawn throughout the afternoon, though villagers passing along the lane could not resist casting curious glances toward the great house. It seemed almost to brood behind its shutters, as though resenting the eyes fixed upon it. Inside, Mrs. Lydia Blunt received visitors with a composure that many later remarked upon. She wore black already, though surely too swiftly for propriety. Her dress seemed to have been laid out in advance, as though she had expected to don it at a moment's notice. Her dark hair was impeccably arranged, her posture unbending. The vicar's wife, Mrs. Ellison, sat across from her in the drawing-room, attempting words of comfort. "My dear, you must be terribly shaken. Such a dreadful business. Marleycombe will never be the same." Mrs. Blunt folded her hands in her lap, her expression calm. "I am unsettled, of course. But the Colonel had not been well for some time. His temper, you know. The doctor warned him often enough." There was no quiver in her voice, no moistening of the eyes, only a faint air of irritation, as if her late husband's death had caused more inconvenience than grief. After the vicar's wife departed, Mrs. Partridge wasted no time in recounting the exchange across the village. Stone-faced she was, not a tear shed. And mark my words, it was no happy marriage. I've heard more than once she'd sooner see the back of him. Others nodded knowingly. The Colonel had been a difficult man. Stories abounded of his shouting at servants, quarreling at parish meetings, and belittling his wife in public. More than one villager thought her relief not only understandable but inevitable. Miss Marple, who happened to be in the draper's shop when the tale was told, merely smiled faintly and said nothing. She had known too many widows in her time, some who wailed convincingly while secretly rejoicing, and others who seemed cold only because their sorrows were borne in silence. One must not, she reflected, take appearances at face value. Still, she tucked away the observation. For in matters of sudden death, the heart of a marriage was often the place to begin. Later that evening, as dusk settled over Marleycombe, Mrs. Blunt sat alone in her drawing-room. The fire crackled faintly, though she had drawn her chair not toward it but away, as though she found the shadows comforting. On the table beside her lay an unopened letter, its seal broken but the contents unread. Her fingers brushed it once, twice, before she drew her hand back sharply. Outside, the snow had hardened into ice, glinting beneath the lamplight. The village might chatter, but here in the great silent house, the widow of Colonel Blunt sat very still, her face unreadable, her thoughts her own. And somewhere deep within her, worry gnawed, though not, perhaps, the kind that grief alone would bring. Chapter 5. The Footsteps Question. By the next morning, the footprints had become the most talked about subject in Marleycombe. The death of Colonel Blunt was dreadful enough, but the single trail of steps in the snow lent the whole affair the flavor of a ghost story. At the King's Arms Inn, the men of the village sat with their pints and debated. "Clear as anything," said Tom Redding, the blacksmith. "Whoever went in never came out again, which means they're still inside that house." "Rubbish," countered Mr. Biddle, the draper, who prided himself on being practical. "The place was searched from attic to cellar. No stranger hidden there. more like the snow covered the tracks when they left. But it didn't snow again till dawn, the blacksmith retorted. Ask anyone. Stars were out clear as day last night. At the post office, Mr. Fawcett, basking in his accidental fame, repeated for the 10th time how he had seen the prince himself, unbroken and precise. Straight up to the side door and not a blessed step away, he said, wagging his finger. You can't explain that away with talk of wind or drifts. Inspector Graves, meanwhile, was not a man to let superstition sway him. That afternoon he returned to Blackthorn Manor to examine the matter himself. He traced the prints carefully from the lane to the side door. They were deep, cleanly made, unmistakable. He crouched, running a finger along the edge of one. The snow was crisp, not yet melted. Size 8 boot, I'd say, he murmured. Not military issue. Perhaps a workman's. Alice the maid hovered nearby, clutching her shawl. Begging your pardon, sir, but I checked every bolt and latch before bed. Nobody could have come in that way. Not unless the master himself. She broke off, shuddering. Graves straightened. Yet someone did. Or else these prints were contrived. The notion startled even him as he said it. Who would take the trouble to fake footprints in snow? And why? That evening, over tea at her cottage, Miss Marple listened as Gladys relayed the latest accounts, wide-eyed with excitement. They say the steps were neat as could be, all in a row, not wandering like a drunkard's. Straight to the door and then nothing. Doesn't that give you shivers, miss? Miss Marple poured her tea calmly. Not at all, my dear. Snow is a very obliging witness, but it can also be most deceptive. One must ask, not only whose footprints they were, but who wanted them to be seen. Gladys frowned, puzzled. But why would anyone want that? Miss Marple's needles clicked softly as she resumed her knitting. To distract, perhaps. Or to suggest what is not true. Human beings are very fond of misdirection, Gladys, as fond in their way as conjurers on the stage. Outside the little window, the snow glimmered under the moonlight, the mysterious trail still unbroken at the manor. The village might argue endlessly, but in Miss Marple's quiet mind the question was already forming more sharply. Were the footsteps a clue to the murderer's identity, or a carefully planted lie? Chapter 6. The Loyal Housemaid. Alice Carter had been in service at Blackthorn Manor since she was 16. Now, at 23, she was regarded by the village as both steady and loyal, the sort of maid one could trust to polish silver without pilfering or to keep the family's affairs discreet. Yet when Inspector Graves questioned her the morning after the colonel's death, she trembled so badly that she could scarcely hold her apron still. I locked up as I always do, sir, she said, standing in the chilly servants' hall with her eyes downcast. Every bolt on the windows, every latch on the doors. I went round twice like I always done. Not a sound in the house after. Nothing until I came down to light the fire and found him there. She swallowed hard, her voice faltering. On the carpet. Dead. Graves regarded her steadily. And you heard nothing in the night? No knock, no creak of a door, no movement at all. Alice shook her head quickly. Nothing, sir. Only the wind. It rattles the shutters something awful when it blows from the west. Her hands twisted in her apron, betraying the nervousness her words sought to deny. Miss Marple, who had been permitted to sit quietly in a corner, her friendship with the vicar's wife gave her a certain unofficial license, watched the girl with mild, interested eyes. She noted the way Alice avoided meeting the inspector's gaze, the way she repeated her reassurances a little too firmly, as if rehearsed. When Graves had finished, Miss Marple leaned forward with her gentle, unthreatening voice. My dear, I wonder. Did you perhaps forget one of the windows? It's such an easy thing to do on a cold night. Alice flushed scarlet. Oh no, ma'am. I checked twice, like I said. But twice is rather unusual, isn't it? Miss Marple's tone was kind, as though she asked about nothing more consequential than the weather. One generally trusts one's first inspection, unless there is a particular reason to be anxious. Alice bit her lip, fumbling for words. I just like to be sure. Miss Marple smiled faintly and returned to her knitting, as if the matter were of no consequence at all. But in her mind, she marked it carefully. A servant who protested her thoroughness too earnestly was, in Miss Marple's experience, often concealing something. Later that day, when Alice was seen hurrying across the snowy lane to the little post office, her cheeks flushed and her eyes darting nervously, Mrs. Partridge declared it proof positive the maid was hiding a lover. "Mark my words," she told Mrs. Hargreaves. "The girl's in over her head. Loyal. Ha! Loyalty doesn't make a girl go red as a beetroot." Whether Alice's secret had anything to do with Colonel Blunt's death remained unproven. But in Marleycombe, suspicion fell quickly, and once fallen, it rarely lifted without leaving a stain. And Miss Marple, sitting quietly by her fire that evening, reflected that the maid's trembling hands might indeed have held more than hearth-brushes in recent days. Chapter 7. The Colonel's Enemies. In a village as small as Marleycombe, grudges could fester like weeds between garden stones. Colonel Blunt, with his booming voice and unyielding temper, had managed to collect more enemies than friends over the years. By the third day after his death, the list was already being whispered over tea tables and across shop counters. There was Mr. Roger Simmons, the land agent, whom the Colonel had once accused of dishonesty in a very public manner at the parish council. Though nothing had been proved, Simmons had been humiliated, and humiliation in a small village was rarely forgiven. Then there was young Peter Ellison, the vicar's nephew, who had been caught trespassing with a fishing rod on the Colonel's land. The Colonel had threatened to have him up before the magistrates, and though he relented at the vicar's pleading, Peter had never forgotten the insult. The man was a bully, Peter was heard to say more than once at the inn. And not least Mrs. Joanna Linton, whose rose garden the Colonel had trampled in pursuit of a stray pheasant. She still declared that he had done it deliberately, out of sheer spite. Miss Marple, listening as Mrs. Partridge recited this catalogue of grievances in the grocer's, remarked mildly, "It does seem that the Colonel was rather forthright in expressing his opinions." "Forthright?" sniffed Mrs. Partridge. "Downright rude, if you ask me. Half the village had reason to wish him ill. If ever there was a man likely to meet an unhappy end, it was him." Inspector Graves, meanwhile, had begun to focus his attention on Mr. Simmons, the land agent. The Colonel's death, coming so soon after a bitter quarrel over boundary lines, looked to him suspiciously like vengeance. "Men have been killed for less," he remarked to Sergeant Hill as they walked the frozen lane. But Miss Marple, from her quiet window in the High Street, thought otherwise. Quarrels about land, roses, or fishing rods were simple things. Loud, yes, but straightforward. Real danger, she knew, came from the hidden enmities, the ones never spoken aloud in the grocer's or muttered in the inn. She thought of Mrs. Blunt's still face, of the maid's trembling hands, and of that mysterious second set of footsteps in the snow. Somewhere among those little details lay the truth. And though the village was eager to condemn Simmons or Peter Ellison, or anyone whose dislike had been plain, Miss Marple's sharp old eyes were turned elsewhere, toward those whose grievances were hidden, not declared. For human nature, she reflected, was very much like Marleycombe's snowy lanes. What was visible on the surface could be deceptive, while what lay beneath was what truly mattered. Chapter 8. A Letter in the Hearth. The study at Blackthorn Manor was a somber place. Dark oak shelves sagging under heavy volumes, maps pinned to the walls, and the faint, lingering smell of cigar smoke. It was here that Colonel Blunt had spent his evenings, usually alone, with brandy at his elbow. Inspector Graves had searched the room thoroughly, or so he believed. But it was Alice, the maid, who first noticed the charred edges of paper among the ashes in the hearth as she went about dusting. She gave a startled cry, and soon Graves and Sergeant Hill were bent over the grate with their tongs. What they lifted out was the blackened fragment of a letter. Its center burned away, but its edges still legible. Graves spread it carefully on the desk. Miss Marple, summoned as a witness rather than a participant, adjusted her spectacles and leaned closer. The fragment read, "Cannot be allowed to come out. You must understand it would ruin everything. Meet me at..." And then the paper dissolved into singed holes and ash. Sergeant Hill whistled softly. "Well, that doesn't sound like friendly correspondence, does it?" Graves frowned. "Half a message is worse than none. Who wrote this? And to whom?" The handwriting smudged beyond recognition. Miss Marple said nothing, but her eyes rested on the loops of the letters, delicate and slanting. A woman's hand, most certainly. She tucked that thought away silently, while the inspector continued to mutter about forgeries and secret meetings. Word of the discovery spread quickly through Marleycombe. By afternoon, Mrs. Partridge was insisting it was proof of blackmail. Mrs. Hargreaves, not to be outdone, declared it was clearly a love letter, hastily destroyed before it could disgrace the family. The grocer's wife added her own theory, that the colonel had stumbled upon some secret smuggling business along the coast. Miss Marple, however, did not speculate aloud. She sat quietly by the vicarage fire that evening, knitting with calm persistence, and considered the single phrase still preserved, "cannot be allowed to come out." There were so many things that might come out in a village like Marleycombe: debts, affairs, quarrels, secrets long buried beneath a veneer of respectability. And Miss Marple, who had spent a lifetime watching human nature play out in small corners, thought she knew the sort of secret that would drive someone to kill rather than let it surface. She let her needles click softly in the silence, the pattern forming stitch by stitch, as carefully as the truth itself was beginning to take shape in her mind. Chapter 9. Footsteps in the snow. The snow that had blanketed Marleycombe was beginning to harden, crisping at the edges where the weak winter sun had touched it. But in the garden of Blackthorn Manor, the tracks leading from the colonel's study window still remained, a trail of footsteps stamped clearly into the whiteness. Inspector Graves stood over them with Sergeant Hill at his side, both men squinting as though the answer might reveal itself if only they stared long enough. "There are two sets," Graves said at last. "One from the house outward and one returning. Straightforward enough. The killer came and went this way." Sergeant Hill nodded. "And heavy boots, sir. A man's tread, not a lady's." But Miss Marple, who had walked out with them under the pretext of taking the air, tilted her head slightly, her pale eyes moving from one footprint to the next. She said nothing for a time, only watching as though listening to the snow itself. At length she remarked in her gentle voice, "It is curious, is it not, how very neat the prints are? No scuffle, no dragging, and yet it was a snowy night, with flakes falling even as late as 10 o'clock. One would expect the outlines to be softened, blurred. But these are sharp, crisp, as though made when the snow had already stopped." Graves frowned. "What are you suggesting, Miss Marple?" "Oh, nothing at all," she said with her familiar modest smile. "Only that timing can be such a subtle thing. Footprints may tell us not only who, but when." The inspector gave a short laugh, more irritation than amusement. "I'll leave poetry about snowflakes to the poets. These tracks belong to our man, and that's that." But Miss Marple's attention lingered. She noted something else, too. The strides were very regular, evenly spaced. A soldier's march, almost. Someone accustomed to steady movement, not the uneven steps of a man in fear or haste. Later that afternoon, as she sat by her cottage fire with her knitting in her lap, she remembered a time in her own youth when a neighbor's boy had played a trick in the snow, walking backwards to make it seem he was coming instead of going. She smiled faintly at the memory, not at the trick itself, but at the thought of how very human it was to think one could mislead by simple appearances. For Miss Marple knew something the inspector did not. Footprints could lie just as easily as people did. And somewhere in those neatly pressed tracks outside Blackthorn Manor, there was a lie waiting to be uncovered. Chapter 10. Whispers at the Vicarage. The vicarage at Marleycombe was, as always, a center of activity. Its warm sitting room, with the faint smell of beeswax and wood smoke, offered comfort to all who passed through its door. And as comfort often invited confidences, it was little wonder that by mid-morning half the village had found some excuse to call on the Reverend and Mrs. Linton. By the fire, Mrs. Partridge and Mrs. Hargreaves were already engaged in their familiar duet of scandal. Their voices, pitched low at first, soon rose in a crescendo of whispers meant to be overheard. "Mark my words," Mrs. Partridge said, leaning forward with relish. "That letter in the colonel's hearth was from a woman. I should know a lady's hand anywhere." "From a woman, perhaps," replied Mrs. Hargreaves, "but not necessarily to him. It might have been a warning. Or even blackmail. Why else would he burn it?" At the tea-table, young Alice, the maid from Blackthorn Manor, sat twisting her hands nervously in her lap. She had been persuaded to speak, though she looked as though she regretted it. "I only saw the edge of it, ma'am. And the inspector told me not to gossip." Mrs. Partridge sniffed. "Nonsense. Gossip is merely the truth passed along." At that, Miss Marple, sitting quietly in the corner with her knitting basket, gave a tiny cough. "Ah, but gossip," she murmured, "is often like a snowball, my dear. It begins small enough, but once set rolling downhill, it gathers all sorts of things not its own, until you can scarcely recognize what was inside it to begin with." Her words drew a polite laugh, but she noticed Alice glance at her with grateful eyes. The girl was clearly uncomfortable with being pressed. The vicar, sensing the tension, tried to steer the conversation back to safer ground, but it was too late. The talk of the Colonel's enemies was spilling forth unchecked. "Why, didn't you hear," Mrs. Hargreaves continued in a dramatic whisper, "that Mr. Peters, the gamekeeper, had words with the Colonel only a week ago? Something about rights of way through the woods. And Peters has a temper, as everyone knows." "And what about Mrs. Rollins?" added Mrs. Partridge eagerly, "whose son was dismissed from the Colonel's service. She has every reason to despise him." Names and motives flew about the room like sparrows startled from a hedge. And through it all, Miss Marple sat serenely, the click of her knitting needles marking a steady rhythm against the tide of speculation. She was not listening for what was said, but for what was not said, the hesitations, the sudden silences, the small looks exchanged. More often than not, truth slipped out not in words, but in the little cracks between them. By the time she rose to leave, she had gathered far more than any of the ladies realized. Not facts, exactly, but patterns, the sort that formed the shape of something larger like stitches in her knitting. As she stepped out into the cold air, Miss Marple thought again of the Colonel's letter, half-burned and half-revealed. Secrets, she reflected, were like smoke in a chimney. Try as one might to trap them, they always found their way out in the end. Chapter 11. The Gamekeeper's Secret. The woods beyond Marleycombe stretched thick and silent beneath their winter cloak. Icicles glittered on bare branches, and the snow lay undisturbed save for the neat tracks of deer and pheasant. It was here that the gamekeeper, John Peters, spent most of his days, moving with the quiet ease of a man more at home among trees than people. Inspector Graves, his breath puffing visibly in the cold, trudged down the narrow path with Sergeant Hill at his side. Peters was waiting for them outside his cottage, a stout figure with broad shoulders and a weather-beaten face, his cap pulled low. "You'll be wantin' to ask about the Colonel," Peters said gruffly, before they could even begin. "And I'll tell you plain, I had no hand in his death." "That's a convenient thing to say," Graves replied dryly. "But half the village heard you quarreling with him last week. Something about the path through the East Woods." Peters's jaw tightened. "That weren't no quarrel. Just a word or two about rights. He wanted the path shut. I said it'd cut off the villagers from the fields. He was stubborn as they come, but I didn't wish him dead." Sergeant Hill glanced at the inspector as though to say, he would say that, wouldn't he? Miss Marple, who had accompanied them under the mild excuse of wanting some fresh air, observed Peters quietly. She noticed the man's boots, heavy-soled, patterned in such a way that they might easily leave the kind of footprints she had seen in the Colonel's garden. But she also noticed something else. The snow clung thickly to them, as though he had been tramping about for hours without brushing them clean. When the inspector pressed Peters further, the gamekeeper's temper flared. "I said he was a pompous old tyrant, but I never raised a hand to him. That night I was out watchin' for poachers by the river. Tom Fletcher saw me there. You can ask him." Miss Marple's eyes softened, and she leaned on her stick as though the walk had tired her. In her gentle way, she said, "It must be lonely work keeping watch in the snow, but I suppose you are used to it. A man in your position must learn to walk very steadily, mustn't he? One cannot afford to stumble and leave a trail too easily read." Peters gave her a sharp glance, then turned away, muttering, I walk steady enough." It was only a small remark, but Miss Marple stored it away carefully. She thought again of the footprints outside Blackthorn Manor. Regular, precise, soldier-like. And she remembered something Mrs. Partridge had once said, about Peters being a man who had served in the war. A soldier. Yes, that might explain the stride. But whether it explained the murder, Miss Marple was not yet ready to say. Chapter 12. The Widow's Confession. The Rollins cottage stood at the far edge of Marleycombe, its garden overgrown even in winter, with ivy clawing at the windows and a broken gate creaking faintly in the wind. Mrs. Rollins was a woman of 50, once handsome but now worn thin, her dark dresses always smelling faintly of lavender sachets and wood smoke. When Miss Marple called upon her, under the gentle pretext of delivering some scones, she found the widow sitting by the fire with red-rimmed eyes. The room smelled strongly of brandy. "You are very kind, Miss Marple," Mrs. Rollins said, though her voice wavered. "It is difficult to be alone in a village that never forgets the past." Miss Marple sat quietly, her knitting bag beside her, and waited. She knew that people often spoke more when not pressed. And indeed, after a silence, Mrs. Rollins gave a small, bitter laugh. "They think I hated the Colonel. They're right, in part. He ruined my husband, drove him to debt and drink and then to the grave. I have never forgiven him." Her hands trembled as she reached for her glass. "And yet, when I heard he was dead, I did not feel the joy I thought I would. Only a kind of emptiness. Do you understand, Miss Marple?" Miss Marple inclined her head. "Yes, I think I do. Hatred, once it has consumed so many years, leaves little behind when its object is gone." The widow gave a sudden, sharp glance. "But don't think I killed him. I couldn't. I wouldn't. Still, I did see something that night." Miss Marple's needles paused. Her voice remained mild. "Oh, and what was that, my dear?" Mrs. Rollins lowered her eyes. "A figure, moving along the lane by Blackthorn Manor. Tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a dark coat. I thought it might be Peters, the gamekeeper, but I could not be sure. The snow was falling too thickly." She hesitated, then added in a whisper, "I did not tell the police. I was afraid they would say I was inventing it, to throw suspicion away from myself. They have always thought ill of me." Miss Marple laid a gentle hand upon hers. "Sometimes, Mrs. Rollins, the truth waits until the right ear is ready to hear it. You have done no harm by confiding now." Yet, as she walked back through the frosty lanes of Marleycombe, Miss Marple's brow furrowed. A tall man in a dark coat. Peters would fit that description, certainly. But others might as well. And what Mrs. Rollins had not realized, though Miss Marple did, was that her very words betrayed knowledge she should not have had. For how could she have seen broad shoulders beneath a coat if the snow was falling too thickly for her to be sure of the man's face? It was a small inconsistency, but Miss Marple had learned never to overlook such things. Chapter 13. A Letter from the Past. The frost lay hard upon Marleycombe that morning, crisp and sparkling in the pale light. Villagers hurried along the lanes with collars turned up, their breath rising in white puffs, the murder still the talk of every hearth and parlor. But inside Blackthorn Manor, the great house where Colonel Redmayne had drawn his last breath, warmth and unease mingled. Inspector Graves had summoned the Colonel's solicitor, Mr. Denning, to examine the late man's papers. Miss Marple, by quiet persistence and the reputation of a helpful old dear, had found herself invited too. The study smelled faintly of pipe smoke and leather. Stacks of letters, documents, and army records were piled across the heavy oak desk. Denning, a prim man with pince-nez and thinning hair, sorted them with meticulous fingers. "It is tedious work," he muttered, "but sometimes the past whispers more than we expect." At length, he drew forth a faded envelope, its edges yellowed with age. The seal was broken long ago, yet the handwriting on the front was strong and unmistakably feminine. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. "From whom?" she asked softly. The solicitor adjusted his glasses. "It appears to be from a Mrs. Caroline Ashcroft, dated nearly 15 years ago." Graves frowned. "And what does it say?" Denning unfolded the paper. His lips moved as he read, and then he said aloud, "I cannot bear what you have done. My husband is ruined because of you. You may think yourself untouchable, but there will come a day when you are forced to answer for it. Do not come near me again." The inspector let out a low whistle. "Well, that sounds like motive enough for murder if she's still alive." Denning cleared his throat. Mrs. Ashcroft died some years past, but she had a son, Edward. I believe he still lives in Bristol. Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked gently in her lap, though her eyes were intent. A son who might have grown up under the shadow of his mother's bitterness. Children do not forget easily when they see a parent wronged. There was silence in the study. Then Graves muttered, "We'll need to make inquiries about this Edward Ashcroft." As the inspector scribbled a note, Miss Marple's gaze drifted back to the letter. The ink had bled faintly, as though it had once been wept upon. She thought of Mrs. Rollins, too, and her tale of her husband's ruin. 2 women, both broken by the Colonel's hand. How many others, she wondered, had been left with the quiet urge for revenge? Later, as she walked back through the snow-laden village, Miss Marple reflected that letters, like footprints, often told more truth than people intended. This one, though written long ago, seemed to breathe fresh life into the mystery. For the past, she knew, never truly stayed buried. Chapter 14. A most peculiar alibi. The Crown and Heart was unusually crowded that evening. Farmers, shopkeepers, and housewives pressed around the fire, their talk circling endlessly back to the murder. Every villager seemed to have an opinion, and every opinion was offered as if it were fact. Inspector Graves, notebook in hand, had stationed himself at a corner table. He called people over one by one, asking simple questions. Where were you at the time of Colonel Redmayne's death? Who could vouch for you? Had anyone seen anything unusual? Miss Marple, quietly knitting by the window, looked for what she always sought, not the words themselves, but the small betrayals of human nature. Hesitations, glances, nervous fingers. When old Mr. Peters, the gamekeeper, was summoned, he gave his alibi with too much certainty. I was at the tavern, same as every Thursday night. Ask Tom Blakely, he saw me. Tom, however, when pressed, looked puzzled. No, Peters. You weren't there till near closing. You came in covered in snow, I remember it. A murmur passed through the pub. Peters's face reddened. Nonsense. I was there the whole time. But already the doubt had taken root. Then came Mrs. Lacey, the grocer's wife, who insisted she had been home all evening. Yet her daughter, a timid girl, whispered that her mother had gone out for nearly an hour, muttering something about needing to clear her head. Mrs. Lacey silenced her with a sharp look, but the damage was done. Miss Marple's needles clicked gently, her eyes never rising from the yarn. She knew too well that villagers often invented alibis for fear of suspicion, not because they were guilty, but because they dreaded being thought guilty. Still, falsehoods had a way of tangling together, until the truth shone out like a loose thread in a carefully mended cloth. The most peculiar alibi, however, came from Reverend Pritchard himself. In his calm, grave voice, he claimed he had been in his study writing a sermon. I spoke with no one, saw no one, but I can show you the notes I prepared. The inspector frowned. That's no alibi at all, Reverend. The vicar only smiled faintly. But it is the truth. I believe God will judge me rightly, even if man cannot. It was a curious answer, and one that unsettled several in the room. For it was an odd man indeed who, in the face of murder, seemed content to let heaven alone bear witness to his whereabouts. As the villagers dispersed, Miss Marple tucked away her knitting and rose to leave. She thought of Peters's red face, Mrs. Lacey's sharp glance, and the Reverend's strangely fatalistic calm. Alibis, she reflected, were like houses built in haste, often more revealing in their weaknesses than in their walls. And in Marleycombe, some of those walls were beginning to crack. Chapter 15. Footprints in the vicarage garden. The snow had hardened overnight, turning Marleycombe into a glittering landscape of silver crusts and long blue shadows. Most villagers trod carefully along the lanes, wary of slipping, but Miss Marple took her morning walk with her usual calm step, leaning lightly on her stick. Her path, quite naturally, brought her past the vicarage. Reverend Pritchard was outside, trimming the frozen branches of a rose bush, his breath misting in the air. He greeted her politely, though there was a touch of weariness in his eyes. You are out early, Miss Marple. Most prefer to stay by the fire on mornings such as this. Ah, she replied, smiling, but one sees more in the cold light of morning than one ever can in the warmth of an armchair. As they spoke, her eyes drifted to the garden. The snow lay thick and undisturbed, except for a curious set of footprints. They led not from the gate, nor from the house, but directly across the lawn, beginning at the wall that separated the vicarage from the grounds of Blackthorn Manor. Miss Marple tilted her head, her expression one of mild interest. "I do wonder, Reverend, who has been in your garden so very early?" The vicar's face tightened almost imperceptibly. "Oh, the milkman, no doubt." Miss Marple's knitting bag swung gently from her arm as she peered closer. The milkman would hardly scale a wall, would he? And these boots, rather larger than his, I should say. For a moment, silence hung between them. The Reverend cleared his throat. Perhaps one of the village boys. Mischief is not unknown. Miss Marple inclined her head politely. Indeed. Mischief. Or something else entirely. As she resumed her walk, her mind ticked steadily. The footprints had been made during the night, while the snow was soft. Someone had crossed from the Colonel's property into the vicarage garden, or perhaps the other way around. That was of great interest, for the Reverend's alibi, such as it was, already left him curiously exposed. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple returned with Inspector Graves, who bent over the marks in the snow. He muttered, "You've an eye like a hawk, Miss Marple. I'd not have noticed these, and if I had, I'd have thought them nothing." "Oh no, Inspector," she said gently. "Footprints are like people's stories. One must ask not only where they lead, but where they begin." Graves frowned down at the prints, then up at the vicarage windows, where lace curtains stirred as if someone had drawn back a corner to watch. The snow preserved secrets, Miss Marple reflected, but only for a short while. Already, the edges of the prints were beginning to soften, the sun's weak warmth threatening to erase them forever. But she had seen enough. The Reverend Pritchard, whether guilty or not, was no longer above suspicion. Chapter 16. The Housemaid's Secret. The kitchens of Blackthorn Manor were always bustling, even in times of sorrow. Copper pots gleamed on hooks above the range, and the scent of baking bread lingered in the air. Yet on that particular afternoon, there was a tension that stilled even the clatter of pans. Miss Marple, seated neatly on a wooden chair near the hearth, appeared merely a kindly old lady come to offer comfort. Her needles clicked rhythmically as she worked at a pair of mittens. But her pale blue eyes rested on Alice, the younger of the two housemaids, who fidgeted with her apron as though her hands could not stay still. "You do look troubled, my dear," Miss Marple said softly. "Is it the murder?" "I dare say the whole village is unsettled." Alice's lips pressed together. For a moment it seemed she might say nothing. But then, in a rush, she blurted, "It's not just the murder, miss. It's what I heard that night." The older cook, Mrs. Beatty, gave a sharp look. "Now, Alice." But Miss Marple raised a gentle hand. "Sometimes a burden grows lighter if one shares it. You may trust me, child." Alice twisted her apron more tightly. "I was taking the Colonel's tray back to the kitchen, just before the storm grew worse. He'd not touched his supper. I was passing the back stairs when I heard voices in the corridor above. I thought it was Mr. Denning, the solicitor, but when I looked up, it was the vicar, the Reverend Pritchard. He was arguing with the Colonel, quite fierce. I could only hear a few words, but the Colonel shouted, 'You'll never prove it.' And the Reverend said something like, 'The truth will out, even if I must drag it into the light.'" Her voice faltered, and she glanced nervously at Miss Marple. "I've not told the inspector. I was afraid they'd think I was making trouble." Miss Marple's needles paused. "Oh, Alice, truth is never trouble. It is concealment that leads to unhappiness. You have been most brave to speak." The girl's eyes glistened, half with relief, half with fear. Mrs. Beatty sniffed. "Better you had kept silent, girl. You don't know what dangers you stir up." Miss Marple looked up mildly. "Perhaps, Mrs. Beatty. But in my experience, silence in a household such as this has often proved far more dangerous." When Alice slipped out of the kitchen, Miss Marple sat for a long while, her knitting lying forgotten in her lap. The vicar had denied seeing the Colonel that night. And yet, the housemaid's testimony, whispered with the ring of truth, placed him squarely in the dead man's company at the very hour he was believed to have died. Slowly, Miss Marple resumed her knitting. The pattern was becoming clearer. And yet, she could not shake the feeling that there was still one stitch missing. Chapter 17. The Hidden Photograph. Snow fell thick upon Marleycombe that evening, muting the world into a hushed silence. The gas lamps glowed dimly through the whiteness, and the village seemed to huddle more closely upon itself, as though to keep secrets safe from prying eyes. Miss Marple, however, believed that secrets always found a way out, often in the most unlooked-for places. It was in the rectory drawing-room that her sharp eye caught the clue. She had called, ostensibly, to return a book of sermons that Reverend Pritchard had once lent her, and the vicar's wife, Mrs. Pritchard, had welcomed her in with weary hospitality. The fire crackled brightly, but the atmosphere was strained. Mrs. Pritchard's hands trembled slightly as she poured the tea. The Reverend, though polite, was noticeably distracted, his eyes seldom meeting hers. Miss Marple's attention drifted to the mantelpiece, where a row of framed photographs stood. Family groups, parish fetes, choirs, and cricket teams. But one small silver frame was tucked behind a larger one, as though hidden from casual view. "Oh, how delightful," Miss Marple said gently, rising to inspect them more closely. "I do so love seeing old photographs. They tell such charming stories." She reached for the smaller frame with the faintest air of absent-minded curiosity. But the reaction was immediate. The Reverend stiffened, and his wife gave a sharp intake of breath. Inside the frame was a faded photograph of a young woman, strikingly beautiful, with dark eyes and a defiant expression. She was standing beside none other than Colonel Redmayne. His arm rested almost possessively on her shoulder. Miss Marple murmured, "Ah, a family friend, perhaps." Mrs. Pritchard's teacup rattled against its saucer. The Reverend took the frame from Miss Marple's hand rather too quickly. "A parishioner from many years ago," he said curtly. "Best forgotten." But Miss Marple had already noted the detail that betrayed more than the Reverend intended. The photograph was not merely old, but well kept. The silver polished, the glass clean. Someone had cared enough to preserve it carefully, even while hiding it away. When Miss Marple took her leave, she walked slowly through the snowy lane, her mind busier than her feet. The Colonel's history of entanglements seemed longer by the hour, and the Reverend, a man of the cloth sworn to truth, had concealed both his meeting with the Colonel on the night of the murder and this relic of a relationship best left buried. Photographs, she thought, are curious things. They capture a moment one may wish forgotten, but cannot erase. They remind the living, and sometimes condemn them. And in that instant, Miss Marple was certain. The young woman in the photograph was not simply a parishioner. She was a key to understanding why the Reverend trembled in the shadow of Colonel Redmayne's death. Chapter 18. Midnight at the Manor. Blackthorn Manor loomed like a shadowed sentinel against the snowy fields, its chimneys exhaling thin smoke into the frozen night. Inside, the great house was still, save for the groaning of timbers under the weight of frost and the occasional distant creak of old floorboards. Most of the household slept soundly, but not Miss Marple. Wrapped in a woolen shawl, she moved silently along the dimly lit corridor, a small candle-lantern in her hand. To any who might stumble upon her, she was merely a poor old lady who had lost her way in the night. But her mind was sharp, her steps deliberate. She had questions, and she believed the answers lay not in gossip or testimony, but in the quiet objects the dead had left behind. The Colonel's study had been locked since his death, but Miss Marple, with her deep understanding of human nature, had suspected that someone would not have resisted the temptation to re-enter. And indeed, when she pressed lightly on the handle that night, it yielded. The study smelled faintly of cigar smoke and polish. The desk was neat, yet in that very neatness Miss Marple sensed interference. Papers had been stacked with too much care. Dust had been disturbed in uneven patches. Someone had been here, and recently. She bent to inspect the carpet near the window. Clear imprints marked the rug, half-moons left by wet shoes. Snow. The storm outside had ended hours before, yet the prints were fresh. "Curious," she whispered. Her candlelight fell upon the bookshelf, where a row of volumes stood in precise alignment, save one. A thick family Bible protruded just slightly. Miss Marple eased it forward. Something fluttered out and landed at her feet. It was a letter. Unfolded, the ink blurred but still legible. The words chilled her. "You will never reveal the truth. If you persist, you leave me no choice but to act. The past must remain buried, or it will destroy us all." There was no signature. Only an initial. P. Miss Marple's lips pressed together. Reverend Pritchard again. But whether as victim of blackmail or blackmailer himself, she could not yet be certain. Suddenly a sound. The faint scrape of a shoe in the hall. Miss Marple quickly replaced the Bible, slipped the letter into her knitting bag, and doused her candle. She stood in the dark, still as a cat, while the door handle turned slightly. Then stopped. A long silence followed. Finally, the sound of retreating steps. Miss Marple let out her breath. She knew then, the killer was not only cunning but close. Watching. Waiting. And as she returned to her room, the letter heavy in her bag, she thought, "The truth is very near now. But so is danger." Chapter 19. The Village Revelations. Morning came bright and brittle, the snow glittering like glass across Marleycombe. The storm had left the village in stillness, but the people were restless. For where murder lingers, tongues wag, and truths half buried have a way of breaking free. At the post office, Mrs. Larcher leaned heavily across the counter, her voice dropping in conspiratorial tone. "They say the Reverend has been hiding something. Something from years ago. And Mrs. Pritchard, poor soul, hasn't smiled since the Colonel's death. Looks guilty, if you ask me." By the hearth of the Red Lion, Mr. Hodge, the innkeeper, wagged his pipe. "Mark my words, it wasn't the stranger at all, no. It was one of our own. Always is. That's how these things go." And in the bakery, Miss Timms, who never missed a scrap of news, whispered to her customer, "I heard Mrs. Alder sobbing in the night. Said she saw someone in the manor garden that evening. But she won't tell the police. Too afraid, I reckon." These murmurs wound their way, like smoke, to Miss Marple as she sat quietly knitting in Mrs. Bantry's parlor. One by one, the villagers drifted in, eager to speak, eager to share. She listened with the same calm patience she reserved for her roses, never interrupting, never judging. It was Mrs. Alder, red-eyed and trembling, who gave the most startling revelation. "I saw him," she confessed, twisting her handkerchief, "in the snow that night. A tall figure, slipping through the orchard toward the manor. But it wasn't the Colonel. No, he was all ready." She stopped, shuddering. "It was the Reverend. I know his walk as well as I know my own husband's." A murmur rose. The room felt charged, as if a storm brewed again outside. Miss Marple did not contradict her, but she noted the detail carefully. Witnesses in grief often confuse what they see, yet sometimes they speak the raw truth others dare not utter. Later, as the villagers departed in twos and threes, Mrs. Bantry turned to Miss Marple, her eyes alight. "Well, Jane, it looks rather black for the Reverend, doesn't it?" Miss Marple clicked her needles together. "Perhaps. Yet it is seldom so simple, dear. One mustn't forget, the Reverend is a man of appearances. And appearances can be deceiving. Always ask, who benefits most from silence?" Mrs. Bantry frowned. "Then you don't believe Mrs. Alder?" "I believe," Miss Marple said gently, "that she saw exactly what she thought she saw, but whether it was the truth, that remains to be proven." She folded her knitting into her lap. The fire popped in the grate. Outside, a rook cawed harshly against the winter sky. Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the letter hidden in her bag, and the photograph of the woman by Colonel Redmayne's side. The past was seeping into the present, and with it came motives sharp enough to kill. Chapter 20. A trap is set. The evening was hushed in Marleycombe, the village tucked beneath a blanket of frost. Lamps glowed faintly in windows, and smoke drifted from chimneys into the still night air. Yet inside Miss Marple's cottage, there was an air of quiet purpose. On her table lay a neatly folded letter, a silver candlestick, and a small glass of sherry. These were not idle objects but pieces of a plan. Subtle, precise, and designed not for force but for truth. Earlier that day, Miss Marple had paid a polite visit to the vicarage, her manner as mild as ever. She spoke of hymns, of parish news, and of Mrs. Alder's distress. All the while, her sharp eyes noted the Reverend's nervous fingers, the way he avoided her gaze when Colonel Redmayne's name was spoken. He had secrets, certainly, but were they secrets of blood or of shame? By afternoon, she had called upon Mrs. Pritchard, offering a jar of her own quince jelly. The poor woman was pale, distraught, yet her grief bore a curious edge. Was it guilt? Or merely fear of what might be revealed? Miss Marple tucked away each detail as though fitting pieces into a puzzle. And now, as twilight deepened, she prepared her little snare. It was not a policeman's trap, of course. No handcuffs, no stern interrogations. Instead, it was a matter of human nature. She had asked a select few villagers to join her the next day at the Red Lion, under the pretense of discussing the upcoming charity fete. But one among them would be the murderer. What none of them knew was that Miss Marple had quietly arranged for a certain object to be brought along. The missing page from Colonel Redmayne's diary, recovered only that morning by young Peter Alder while clearing snow from the orchard hedge. It bore a single, damning entry. "If she threatens again, I shall have no choice but to end it. God forgive me." Miss Marple had not shown the page to anyone yet. She meant to watch carefully as it was revealed, to see whose mask would falter, whose composure would break. As she sipped her sherry by the fire, she allowed herself the faintest sigh. "It will all be rather unpleasant," she murmured. "But better to face the truth now than let an innocent soul bear the weight." Outside, the frost thickened on the window panes. Inside, the trap was ready. And Miss Marple, with her quiet wisdom, knew the next day would bring the killer one step closer to exposure.